Hi, hello everyone. Well, I think I'll start from the end, and I first of all wanted to thank everyone for joining today. It's been done quite on a late notice, and also thank you for all the resource that has been put together from the AA. I'm thinking about the facilities team and of course the AV, which is recording this session now. I also want to thank the AA for the continuous support in placing circular economy in the school as a central component of the curriculum. I, of course, want to thank the audience because you will see some of the work being produced here is a common work, and some of you have contributed, if not in person, through the knowledge. And I'm also, of course, thanking all the contributors, which your work is really the substance of what we are for, like together today. So it's really through your work that I think we can continue the conversation and learn from each other and hopefully get the industry into a future that would involve more material reuse and more care and more understanding of repercussion and design decisions. To shift the industry towards this direction, we believe in galvanizing common knowledge, and this effort has been started by Rotor more than 15 years ago with the creation of the platform Opalis, and which is really trying to address this need. And it's a very practical tool, which is inventorizing all the material resellers that are available across the territory. So Rotor started this project in Belgium, but it got further developed through EU interregional funded project. And if you're not familiar with the platform, which I believe you might, since you have an interest in the topic, I'll present it very quickly. But so the material resellers are geolocalized, and every address has been visited. And it provides facts and information about the specific materials that are being stored, salvaged, in some cases processed, and also pictures taken by the visiting teams and the surveyors. And basically, I think through this, the organization of this roundtable, we want to continue on this effort, which we started in 2018 by focusing on the UK. Currently, these addresses are in what we call the dealer's sandbox, which is actually the research and academic part of the Opalis project. On this platform, actually, something that might be less known is the example part. And the example part is the survey of all case studies and inspiration. So the example part is twofold. The case studies are communicating about projects where the collaboration and the reuse relationship have been particularly successful and managed to lead to reuse operations. And so it deployed a kind of detailed information on the project and the different phases that led to salvaged. And then there is the inspiration part, which are more separate moments of design, which features components that are being reused, something you might refer more as a sort of Instagram, Pinterest-friendly approach. So it goes from very prosaic reuse of tile, for example, to salvage contemporary windows or intervention that require a bit more design thinking. So this year, part of our focus is going to be to gather this type of projects with a special focus on the UK. And so this is a bit of an open call. If you know any of this project, or if you would like to contribute further, please contact us on this address. There is also a form next to the door to add more details and contact. And you are going to understand where this leads us to. Basically, all the projects that will be featured today, we really hope to invest into the editorial work to include them on the Opalis page of exemplary project, because they are pushing the limit of what reuse can do today. We're really happy to be able to discuss them with you together. I wanted to say that this effort is really an initiative. It's only the beginning. The only resource we have is a lot of generosity from you and goodwill. We hope that maybe in the future we can benefit from structural funding to be able to support all the current stakeholders that are working on this type of projects. And so today we will hear from the following project architects and collaborators and how this successful reuse relationship helped forge the design with reuse component. So we will have Dylan Radcliffe-Brown, which is in charge of project as 6A and also the sustainability coordinator. He is currently undertaking research into demolition design in the UK and Europe, supported by the RIBA Research Fund 2024. Then Maria Chiara Piccinelli with Robert Greer will be talking about the LSE Fitzroy Logic Global Hub, which is a competition that DCA has won under the auspice of Maria Chiara. And she continues to lead this project. And she also teaches at the London School of Architecture. And I believe within DCA you contribute to the sustainability group by exploring material salvage and pushing reuse in the project of the practice. Robert Greer is a great collaborator to the unit. He's been supporting our work since several years now. He's from the stone restoration contractor PAY, and he works with some of the larger government and heritage clients. And so it's key to see how he can gravitate across scales and also across techniques, such as pushing as much as possible the reuse of stone ashlar with his extended expertise from the traditional stonemason skill to the latest technology. And then Claire Deleuze, she's a project architect at Stanton Williams in charge of the Museum of London. And I hope you'll be able to complement a little bit this description. And then Emily Wickham, thanks for joining. You're a designer at Assemble and a tutor at Nottingham University. And your work reflects your interest in civic projects, material and making. And you will be sharing about the public park in Bermondsey. Well, thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And it's great to be here and talking on this topic. So we only have 10 minutes, which means I'm going to have to go relatively quickly. I think I've put too many slides in, but 6A, I think, are known for their projects in reuse, especially in heritage contexts. Obviously, having worked with both kind of significant heritage, but also post-industrial buildings and forgotten buildings, working with the kind of context of London, which is a kind of continuous renewal. And so I think in a way, maybe counterintuitively, I've selected to talk about a new build project, partly because I understand that everyone is going to be talking about reuse projects, and partly because I think the relationship that was set up in this project is really key to our entry from heritage into working with reused. And reclaimed materials. So it's the project for Cowan Court, which is Churchill College in Cambridge, and it was completed in 2016. The project uses different approaches to reclamation and applies the word reuse in a kind of broader sense, an architectural way, not only literally with the cladding. So it's a 68 resident building courtyard, which you can see there. Do we have a pointer? Yeah, nice. So it's this one next to the existing 1960s brutalist project there on the right. 68 bedrooms, student residence, effectively. And starting in 2008, when we won the project, it went on pause and then came back in sort of 2012. And many of you might know the kind of famous competition for this project, which garnered submissions from various different famous architects of the time. Shepherd Robson won the project, and the result is these series of interlocking courtyards. It's famous for its kind of English brutalism, which is exemplary of the time, and really the kind of innovation of this kind of white heat of technology 1960s project is part of the reason that the clients were so kind of interested in a new layer of innovation with this project, where we introduced ours. There you can see down on the white of the model. And so formally, the Cowan Court reflects its typology. It reflects the same square court of the exact footprint of the existing buildings, but where the original staircases produces a kind of vertical accessibility. You can see in the new on the right hand side, a kind of cloister, internal cloister faces in towards the courtyard there, with a kind of densely planted garden, making all of the rooms fully accessible and facing out towards the kind of great views beside. The project combines glulam, CLT, softwood traditional framing, as well as obviously reclaimed timber on the facade, and plays into the kind of reuse of the concrete tectonics that you find in the original Shepherd Robson building. The facade itself, again, echoes the existing buildings in 3 layers, with a clear horizontal banding, where this kind of classical column entasis curves at a different level at each floor, and the kind of windows are spread around playfully on the facade. The reuse of timber is the original cottages are kind of ostensibly, or they appear to be largely of brick and concrete, but actually there's quite a lot of detailing in the timber detailing in the hardwood doors and the fine rooms of the central college. So the kind of reuse of timber and the total application of timber on this project really feels like a kind of continuation of the materiality of the project, especially in the kind of reflection of the cast texture that you can see there on the formwork. And then running into the details of the side, the frieze up at the top, again plays on a kind of mimicry of this is for any of you who know the college, this is the entrance gate. So all of these kind of elements of reuse, not only, I guess, in a kind of broader sense of a kind of working with the existing. In terms of the procurement of the timber, we, as I said, entered this through our kind of heritage experience. We had worked with both Declan Malloy in London, in Essex, for the reclaimed floors in Raven Row, and with Ashwells on the treehouse and the extension of a listed building. But for the procurement of this project, we began with looking around the UK at various suppliers, where we quite quickly found that the timber that was available in the most quantity, most reliable quantity and most reliable sizes was something called French wagon timber, effectively reclaimed from the carriages that had driven around Europe for decades. So typically these are kind of 30 years old and a fairly consistent size. The search was done largely by the project architect, Cecile, so I should say that I was only a part one when this project was being done. And Cecile's role as the project architect was to go around and source these timbers. Obviously, in kind of current circular parlance, we might call this person a component hunter. This is obviously something that becomes perhaps a more permanent role in contemporary offices. But the main three suppliers that we found of this wood were BCA Matériaux Anciens, if I've got my French pronunciation there, Aude-Line will tell me. Declan Anti-Woodland Falls in Essex and Rick Storms in Belgium. BCA had the largest stock on their own premises, and the others had identified distribution chains. So in the end, we got them to kind of price those along with our QS, giving them the drawings, the schedule, and the specification. And in 2014, we got quotes where they were all roughly the same, around 150 per square meter. Now, the QS had costed for this at 210 per square meter, which, I think in hindsight, you kind of understand that. Hopefully, that was a relationship, or that was something that we had spoken to the QS with about early on, in order to kind of make sure that we understood that reclaimed material does come with additional prices, so that the eventual cost of this material would have been higher than that in terms of the activities that followed. So we visited BCA in their headquarters in France in 2014 and looked at their stock. They had 600 square meters of 65 mil boards and 100 square meters of 45 mil boards. We decided that we could split the 65 mil boards into two and get the two sides. And that would give us about 1,800 square meters, and we needed 900 square meters. Now, initially, that seems like, you've got loads. But in conversation with BCA, we understood that actually the expected wastage was about 50%, and so that was the perfect amount of material. In hindsight, maybe they inflated the numbers just so we bought all of it. No, I think it's a pretty typical thing for a timber joiner to say, I need twice as much material to make whatever it is. So this was the kind of oversupply of material that we ended up getting. They also produced various samples when we arrived. So you can see there that on the corner, we kind of added a solid piece in order to effectively not reveal the depth of the cladding, so that it became much more about texture and surface and colour. You can also see the lapping of the joints, and we elected for a lap joint, partly because it deals with when you cut the timber, it's likely to cup, it could react once it's cut, and all the stresses are released and it cuts. So the lap joint is the kind of most effective way to reduce that potential cupping, but also the kind of widened, the large lap also means that first you get a kind of pinstripe effect of the light bringing out the kind of dark and the adding to the texture of the reclaimed material, but also again a kind of an aspect of tolerance. One of the most crucial things about using reclaimed materials is getting approval in terms of planning, I think this was something that we could move confidently through, having worked with bespoke facades, unique facades before. But with the client, it was a big risk. And something that we kind of entered with a little trepidation. So we had located the timber 6 months before tender, and BCA were not going to hold on to the material for us without a deposit, fairly reasonable sized deposit. And so we produced this report for them, a long document explaining how we had acquired the material, what we understood about it, our confidence in it. But we also, eventually it came down to a meeting with the Churchill College Committee, made up of almost entirely academics and I think maybe 40 odd people. And so Tom in the meeting was asked, is this facade, has it ever been done before? And that's a kind of question that you would typically have to come to with, maybe 5 references and say, yes, it's been done before, don't worry about that. But in this situation, because of the procurement styles, this was design and build in the end, because of the scale of the project, because of the client, we just didn't have those references. And so Tom said no, and luckily the response from this academic was, so you mean we were the first? And I think whether it is to do with, Churchill College's ambition to be innovative again with the architecture, or simply just a kind of academic research interest in doing something new and trying something out, that was a kind of key success and a key win really for the project. So I think in this kind of, it really speaks to the kind of circular procurement today, the need for the fact that the Churchill was able to then buy the timber ahead of procurement was a real risk of theirs. And so today, obviously, we look for kind of procurement facilities and marketplaces which can absorb or reconcile these differences in timescales between projects which are about to finish or about to reach a certain critical stage. Another approval that we needed to get was from TRADA on the cladding quality. We approached TRADA not only on the detailing and the specification, but on the to produce we wanted to get a certificate for this cladding. They tested it. They produced a report, not a certificate, and where another client, a typical developer, might feel that was not enough. Cambridge, as a college, university college, they never sell their buildings. They have a 300-year kind of lifespan and development plan. They can recognise that they don't necessarily need a warranty on something to say, okay, if we sell this, we need to have a certificate for it. So that was another way that we were able to kind of pass maybe a hurdle that you would typically get in a reuse project. TRADA produced a specification which was quite long, but I'll just read one example. Face finished dim varies from 150 overall. Note this is meant to minimize the wastage, but a max 150 is to avoid pulling fixings during the shrinkage and expansion. So, obviously the way that you deal with a reused or reclaimed material has to flow through all of the production that an architect is involved in, down to the specification. The contractor SDC, to whom 6A was novated in stage 5, was a really good choice, partly because they didn't use that many subcontractors. They had a lot of people in-house, and that meant that they had a large factory where they would produce things, and their joiners were able to produce this large mock-up, full one-to-one scale mock-up on site of one of the sections of the facade, which was shown to all the subcontractors. And one of the kind of key lessons that we learned was to avoid, so you can see that there's the horizontal division there, but over a 36-meter facade, it was decided that actually, getting vertical alignment across all of these boards was just ridiculous, especially because you have a slight curve on one and a slightly different curve on the next, and then a slightly different. So the kind of key learning was just don't try and make those wins. There are other places to make wins. Another bit of detailing that was developed alongside the contractor was to avoid, you can see these dark patches beside the windows, and that was where effectively the contractor said it's much easier for us if we prefabricate these timber boards in panels and fix them on. And so what we ended up doing is leaving off one board on the side there that then, for on site, the exact board site width could be laid in. So yeah, I think you can even see it, maybe not at this scale, but you can't really see it from this scale. The contractor also produced a rig on site that helped them take these prefabricated panels and lift them directly on. I think another key element in working on reuse projects is engaging with the contractor in the same way that you will on a film or something. Building jigs, or in a workshop you build a jig to make something that's bespoke for that exact purpose, but you're going to do lots of times in order to deal with something quite specific. And so the jig that they produced in order to lift these onto the facade was a kind of key suggestion by the contractor that was really helpful for us. A DEFRA report recently released indicate that between 1998 and 2011, the reuse of reclaimed timber fell between 90 to 98%. Obviously, when you compare that to total consumption, which has increased, that's an equivalent reduction of reuse of 9% of timber in 1998. So we use every 1 in 10 pieces of timber was reused, has now dropped to 0.43% in 2011. So the reuse of timber is actually hugely dramatic, and that is consistent across the majority of, or a lot of, materials. So we have to drastically increase the reuse of timber. And I think looking at the project again, you saw the photos of the structure exposed. A lot of it was new timber, and I think potentially we would look at opportunities to swap out, let's say, the timber doors or any of the kind of softwood framing with other reclaimed products. This project came, I think, before circularity became a kind of big topic, and so it progressed in a pretty improvisational manner, one that came from our understanding of the nuances of working with heritage and having to engage with quite particular and circulatory, collaborations with different people, and I think obviously BCA participated and contributed a huge amount, but I think that another key relationship that was necessary there was Trada, and almost acting as a kind of material authenticator, taking a material from and kind of allowing it to be used in a UK context. So that was a kind of another maybe key relationship there for us. I think that's it. Sorry if I went over. Oh, sure. God, you've put me on the spot there. Do I know exactly what Trada is? The Timber Research and Development Association. There you go. Thank you, Robert. They are the association that has the kind of timber expertise across the UK, and they produce a number of reports and guidance, and yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to briefly run through the project we are developing with the LSE. That is the new Large Global Hub. We're talking about this building. Is an existing building and sits in Lincoln's Inn Field. Is part of the LSE campus, and we did a competition 2.5 years ago, and our proposal is the center top, and is the only proposal that actually retained the existing building in large quantity. So this was actually why we were able to really win the competition. The competition was solely, I would say, telling the story of the value of the material of this building. Not the value per se of the building, because it's not a listed building. As you saw, many of the other competitors actually decided to not disregard the facade completely, but our key, slide was actually how we were able to lower 50% the impact of our proposal compared to all the others. And we really wanted to demonstrate how it's important that we save carbon, not so much in the future, because probably, hopefully, the whole grid will be decarbonized, but how massive change would it be to actually retain the building and reuse the material from the building now. So it was like a big shift to not just saving carbon, but saving it now and not in 50, 60 years' time. So this is like, in a nutshell, what the building is. You see the existing there. We retain the majority of the building and then extending at the top. So that's the condition of the building that we found. Is actually a collection of buildings that has been built in different phases. So you can see all the inside, let's say, floor to ceiling height. It was very different north to south, very different to move inside the building. There are floors that don't communicate one another. You actually need to go down to the ground floor to reach the same level from the south, for example, entrance. And here you can see how we really worked with the existing building, opening up the center and connecting the ground floor to street level. Really diverse program inside that we were able to fit within, again, the existing building is kind of public ground floor and first floor departmental areas. At the very top is an education facilities with classrooms and services for the executive education. I'm glad that you presented an educational building. So somehow we see really the university to pushing this agenda very much at the forefront. Sustainability was key part of the brief. So the first net zero carbon building for the LSE, passive house certification, BREEAM outstanding, well platinum, low energy in use, and circular economy. So the circular economy for us became really, really key within the design process. And I feel that we are day to day really pushing on the circular economy, working with as many partners as possible. Like Pay, for example. So that existing building, this is the project. And yeah, just an image on the outside. You can see how the existing facade is growing into the new building, and the entire facade becomes a contemporary design. So the project represents a new approach to reuse that moves beyond the pure heritage and conservation concern and recognize the building should be protected for their material quality and their physical capital. As important part of the fight against the climate change. So what does it mean is really looking at your building as your material quarry. So you take the building you're working on and in its entirety, you don't waste what you already have, but you're able to work with it. And kind of the new architecture always grows from what you can find there. So as I was saying, big study on the existing building, actually also with the students of the Department 18 from last year. There was great collaboration. It was really, really nice to actually share the knowledge of the building and actually think about how to incorporate circular economy in every aspect of the design, even starting from a very research approach, like as you're doing. So how can we use sustainability targets to drive new design ideas? So we wanted to shift a bit the thinking from, box ticking exercise. Yes, we do this, but how actually they drive, or the sustainability targets are driving the way that we design, and how we use them to actually inspire new design ideas. And that's the building as it is now. So we start working at the very top, and inside there is no, let's say, hoarding on the facade, because actually we are keeping it at the moment. We are just deconstructing, so the pure construction didn't start yet. And I mean, as Robert will tell you in a second, we started saving stone by stone. We took all the opportunities to actually save as much material as possible. Procurement key, definitely is a key part of the process, because especially when, in our case, we had two contractors. One is the enabling work contractor, so they are deconstructing the building, and the main work contractor is not appointed yet, but we know we are working with them already in order to make sure that the building, the materials that we are saving, they will find a proper place within the new building. So, for example, pay is a really key link in between the two. So we need to learn how to work beyond just the relationship between the architect and the main contractor. You really need to know the whole team and work closely with everyone. So this is exactly the work that Pei is doing, collecting the stones. We went on site several times. We did a survey. We learn about the existing building and the opportunities that we had there. And finally, those are the coping elements that were at the very top of the building. So those are the stones that were at the edges of all the steps of the existing building, that they were collected and stored at pace. We are doing a very similar approach also to the inside. This is just a peek of what is going on inside the building. So we are taking the opportunities to save as much as possible of the bricks that we have and that were part of the build-up of the internal walls. So we are cleaning them, palletizing them, and then they will be they are now ready and waiting for the next contractor to come on board and reuse them in the project. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Robert from Pay Stonework. And rather than being a designer, I'm a practitioner, so I've been dismantling buildings now for 28 years. And we're stonemasons, and stone is such a fantastic material, and it's really suited to the ability to be dismantled and repurposed and reused. And there are so many good benefits to its use. This is the snapshot at the start of my career. So in 1995, we used to just throw all the rubbish away. We didn't consider the idea of recirculating materials. We then moved into recycling in 2005, and then we worked into the circular economy in 2015. And there's been a real shift from 2015 to 2024. And I think part of that is down to the London planning policies. We see the difference between London and the South East, and predominantly London, really, and the rest of the UK. There's a real focus on material circularity and repurposing in London, and I'd say the rest of the country is about 5 or 10 years behind in that development of ideas. And there's some great work that's been done by the likes of the Institute of Structural Engineers that really does look at the idea of how you repurpose and reuse materials, with the main premise being trying to use less stuff. And it's not always possible to do nothing. And we sit in the second box down, which is build less. So we try and take the materials, store them, and then reuse them in the most beneficial form. It's not a new thing. There's a great word called spolia, which is the Roman word for, or Latin word, sorry, for the dismantling and repurposing and reuse of stone on the next project. And they were very good at it. Constantine's arch here, which he built as a tribute to himself, is actually built from the 3 previous emperors. So you can see Trajan's work in green, Marcus Aurelius is in blue, and Hadrian's in yellow. So they're very good at repurposing stone. We need to understand the building before we dismantle it, and this is the Asburn High Dam back in the 1950s, early 60s, and it was all done with a theodolite and tape measure. Fortunately, now we can use point cloud, and we can get to an accuracy of about plus or minus 8 millimeters with our initial scan. We can then do GPR surveys, which allows us to understand what the depth of each stone is. And from there, we can create a 3D model. And this is an extract of one of our projects. It's 6,500 stones. It's about 2,500 ton of masonry that we're dismantling. And we're going to thin this building down. We're going to reduce it in thickness and put it back as a thinner version of itself. And that space that we've created, we're going to fill with insulation and structure to allow it to go back as a more efficient facsimile of the original. But all of the red bits are going to be cut off. And that's what we refer to as spolia. So this 2,500 ton of stone that we've dismantled, we're going to put back about maybe 1,500 to 1,800 ton. So we're going to have 700 ton of spare stone that we're then going to start to repurpose and reuse. And it's classed as carbon free because it's second hand, it's come off a building already. So we look at the circularity of stone, and it's very high value. When we dismantle a building, we normally achieve about a 95 to 98% material recovery rate. We may sacrifice some stones, or some stones may be fractured and damaged that we can't reuse, but typically we're getting a high number. And then when you start to look at its repurposing and reuse, looking at the LCA assessment of materials, it's a very high circularity percentage. Like all butchers, we try and use as much of the original stone as possible. But it's something we've got to be mindful of with stones, particularly limestones and sandstones. They are sedimentary. So we have to be respectful of the bed of the stone. So ashlars, vertical face stones, the sedimentary beds are horizontal. Copings, it's working in a slightly different way. So we have to be very, very careful in how we cut and repurpose stone to get its best use. The way we dismantle the stone is we use traditional quarrying techniques, and here we have plug and feathers, and this is what we use for splitting the stones to break the bond between them. We then use a lovely thing called a Lewis pin, which is what we use to extract blocks from the quarry, and that allows us to lift stones up to about 2 ton. And once we've lifted it up enough, we then strap it and move it on block and tackles. We then catalogue all the material, like we saw at the LSE, so we then know what we have as an inventory of materials for repurposing. And then it goes into one of our warehouses. At the moment, we've got 8 buildings in our warehouse. It's about 5,000 ton of stone in total. They're all at different points in their journey of repurposing and reuse. Stone is quite an interesting material. We have a lot of provenance on most stones that we use. There is an expected set of testing that we have to comply with, but there are certain things that if we check quickly, we'll know that we're getting the kind of stone that we have historic data on, then we can gain some confidence in its reuse. When we look at its carbon value, the numbers that we're really focusing on are the A1 to A4 values. And they're the ones that really affect the comparison of new stone versus repurposed stone. And if you look at new stone, it's typically for a 50 millimeter coping, we're looking at about 23 kilograms of CO2e per meter squared. Sorry, for 75 thick stone, that is. For repurposed stone, because we don't have to consider the value of the stone extraction, we only have to look at its cutting and then its transportation to and from the site. It's about a third of the value. So carbon cost is a significant benefit in reusing repurposed stone. Here are some of the copings from the LSE, and the blue rectangles are the cuts that we're going to get out of that. And we brought one along today so you can see how beautiful a repurposed piece of stone can look. And if you remember, we had this image earlier on, and we were showing where we are now, which is this circular economy driven by legislation and planning expectation. This is my own personal view. I think 2030 plus, there'll be a new character in this image, which will be that we won't be using any quarried material, and we're going to have to use each building as a material bank. Sorry, I'll go back on. I can't come here today without looking at some of the work we're doing with the Stone Collective. The Stone Collective is 2 quarries, 2 operators, and 3 quarries and 2 operators. And we're really focusing on trying to push the boundaries of the use of stone. And if you think of all that stone that we have spare, we're now looking to see how we can use it in different forms. The first thing we're saying is you can't have best grade, middle grade, and poor grade. Everything has to be used. We have to try and use as much of the stone as possible. So if there's a little shell or blemish, that shouldn't stop you from using that material. The other thing we're looking at is post-tension stone. So all of that stone that we saw in our warehouse, we're looking to cut those into blocks to put a post-tension wire down the middle of it. Therefore, we don't need concrete. We can create post-tension stone columns, post-tension stone beams, which then removes the quantum of concrete that we need for the construction of a building. And if you look at the Stone Collective, it'll provide you with some knowledge and the research we're doing this year on post-tensioning and fire damage and how we can move it forward as an alternative to potentially timber, but definitely instead of concrete. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm Claire. I'm from Stanton Williams. While you just see me here today, while you just see me today, there's a huge collective that makes up the team that are working on the London Museum, including Pay Stonework, who's been working with us for years, and many other collaborators along the way. So the Museum of London is currently located in the Barbican site, for those who know it, but perhaps you don't know it. It's quite hidden away. The existing buildings really don't work particularly well for the museum, and they're only able to show a very tiny percentage of their collection. So they were on a hunt for kind of a new site. The Smithfield site was offered to them after a huge amount of failed opportunities, or depends how you want to look at it, other options for the site, and really kind of felt like it was match made in heaven, really. Before we started the project, it was quite important for us to understand where the buildings had come from and what they meant to London and how we might be able to reuse them. So the site had been used for as a livestock market for about the last 800 years. There'd always been some kind of trading on the site, and including, it also had St Bartholomew's Fair, huge kind of 3-day festival in London where loads of merriment and all sorts going on there. So it was really culturally important point within London. And that site kind of completely transformed when the railway came in the kind of 19th century. And it meant goods could suddenly start coming from much further afield. And about the same time, Parliament passed an act that no longer would you have live livestock on site, you would have dead livestock to be trading instead, which saw this kind of development of trading quarter. So you've got the 2 traditional kind of metropolitan meat markets at one end, which are not a part of Museum of London, and then the general market, fish market and poultry market, which was the site which we were redeveloping. They were built by Sir Horace Jones, kind of a great Victorian architect of the day. The general market, while it was intended as a fruit and vegetable market, actually, due to the popularity of meat, by the time it had been built, started trading meat instead. And underwent kind of huge amount of change in the 50s when the last B-2 rockets and the war actually demolished part of the site, and that was rebuilt in the 50s. The poultry market was originally a part of the kind of string of Sir Horace Jones buildings, but there was a huge fire in the 60s, which saw kind of complete redevelopment of it by T.P. Bennett and Ove Arup. The intention at the time was actually to flatten all the rest of the Victorian buildings and for the 60s building to kind of march on its way through that trading quarter. So we had this kind of beautiful contradiction of two very different buildings to kind of start with. The General Market building itself had been left abandoned for about 30 years or so by the time an emergency set of works with pay started on site, basically to try and stop the buildings from completely crumbling around us. So while their bones, their beautiful, wonderful spaces, there was huge amounts of disrepair and kind of damage that had been done through that abandonment. The basement was being used as a car park and storage. Crossrail kind of moved in there for a little while. But yeah, huge amount. And then parts of the basement had actually been blocked up. We unblocked them and found some wonderful spaces kind of hidden in catacombs as well. And the poultry market had traders a handful of traders in up until quite recently. So it was kind of quite a different set of conditions. So those bones were kind of the basis really of starting to look at how the museum might inhabit those spaces. And really the aspiration from the outset was very much to try and reuse and utilize the buildings as best as possible. Kind of, I guess, well, we're talking about circular economy, that's reuse of the material, but the buildings, as much of the buildings that we can keep as possible was the benefit. So worked really hard with the museum to look at how we could organize those spaces in quite like a passive way, essentially. So, for example, some of the permanent galleries, which have, some of the most demanding objects within, were placed in some of the cooler locations. Some of the museum's briefs had to adapt and change to the spaces we had available. So that dialogue with the museum was really critical to understanding how we could organise and utilise those buildings. So it ended up in this arrangement where we created a new kind of temporary gallery within the poultry market because there was an opportunity there to be able to put that insertion in. But the general market trying to use essentially the bones of what was there already, and very minimal insertions went in there onto the material reuse itself. So while this is quite a simplistic diagram, we tried to look at all the material within the two sets of buildings. They've undergone kind of huge amount of adaptation and change over the years. Some of them providing, very obvious conservation reuse, others providing less obvious conservation and heritage material. First and foremost, we're in a very kind of lucky position in many ways that we've got a client who's incredibly interested in trying to reuse as much as we possibly can. Some of the material is either used within the project or sometimes even going into the museum's collection, for example. So got that lucky kind of option within that. Otherwise, if we're not able to use it within the project, looking to kind of work with the salvage market as much as possible. If that's not possible, then kind of diverting to kind of recycling either the material itself, but sometimes recycling back into the project as a new material. And then the very last options, which we really don't want to go to, but are the reality possibly of construction projects, is kind of tracked waste disposal, and even kind of 1% going to landfill, which nobody wants to be doing, but it is, again, part of the reality potentially. So some of the more easier kind of heritage material reuse for the project. As I say, the site has undergone these many layers of different history throughout its many lives, and we didn't want to necessarily erase all of those lives. And that kind of ties in quite well with the circular economy side of things, where we're not trying to strip back every single layer. Sometimes we're embracing the layer. Sometimes we might need to do a neater conservation type approach. Other times, a new insertion is the most appropriate because of the condition of the existing. Some of the more successful wins, we have managed to reuse a huge amount of salvaged timber on the site. And some of this is through some very kind of unusual relationships, I would say. So Julian Harrop, who's working on the project.
This is both.
Yeah, exactly. So Julian Harrop, who's working on the project, had a relationship with a boat yard who managed to process a lot of the timber on site for us. Given the scale of this project, relationships like that become quite surprising in a way, that have made its way into the kind of construction procurement and how we move things forward. So in essence, huge amounts of salvage timber went to the boatyard to get processed. That was kind of visually inspected, denailed, etc., sorted, and kind of held at the boatyard until, for example, site said, oh, we need X amount of this. That was then transferred to site. So operating quite a kind of just-in-time model that everybody had to kind of essentially buy into and work with. So I think you can just about make out pace. So that all that reclaimed timber was utilised on site, and hopefully will continue as that model. As I say, the building was in a huge amount of disrepair. So you can see here how almost every end of those roof trusses had to be repaired and replaced because water had been pouring in the building for so long. Some of the other kind of easier wins as well. So wherever there were new insertions, we reclaimed the bricks in a similar way, kind of sorted, cleaned, reused wherever possible. If it wasn't possible, we've run out of bricks. We've utilised reclaimed bricks from the market. Slates, similar type story. Some of the existing roofs were in such poor condition that it was not really feasible to keep them as such, but we we kept all of the slates from site and reused those throughout the existing roofs. We had some wonderful original shop fronts from the kind of original construction, which again, sometimes will need repair, but the bones of what we've got there are so wonderful that we're able to kind of conserve them. And other little items come from the building inventory that we did from the outset. So lights, fireplaces, signage, kind of spiral stairs, all kind of going back into the scheme, proposed scheme. Some things like, for example, the existing spiral stairs are a bit of a challenge from a regulation point of view. We've had to adapt them perhaps a little bit more than we would have liked to for building control, but we've kind of got there just about. And then moving into the poultry market, quite a different ilk, had these really amazing high quality hardwood timber battens, which we're utilising in things like furniture and timber cladding within some of the spaces. The meat racks we're using as lighting rigs, trying to hold a lot of the MEP on. Some of the roller shutters we're getting refurbished, reused, signage as well. And kind of, I guess, actually, this kind of summarises some of the process quite well, that dismantling of the building, trying to understand what we can reutilise as much as we possibly can within the scheme, from door handles, but even door handles we've had to go through kind of building control, trying to make sure they're happy with the slight discrepancies. It's interesting. And then we've managed to work with several partners for some of the material we weren't able to use on site. So Yes Make utilised some of the existing carpenter tiles. They recycled them and used them for a waterproof cladding. Some of the door frames went to got refurbished and then went into a community centre via the timber company that we were working with at the boatyard. Global Generation took a load of we had a lot of temporary site set up just to get safe access into certain areas. That timber got reused with Global Generation. Even things like whiteboards from the existing buildings went into some of those as well. Material Index helped make a lot of those connections with various companies. We even had a small local pub, I think, in the next one. Yeah, a small local pub take some of the ceiling fans and industrial sinks. Lasco's took the secondary columns. So we've had a lot of quite good wins, I'd say. Given the scale of the project, it always feels like we could do more, and making those connections was the hardest part about trying to reutilise the material that wasn't able to be used on the project. Some really boring bits, apologies. So some of the bits that made it possible to reutilise the material, we did a material inventory from the very outset, looking at what we thought we could reuse. That had to go into the specification so we could make sure that it was captured and controlled in that way. And then everything gets kind of tracked all the way through. So from condition to quantity, where it's going. Maybe that person's kind of accepted it, not accepted it. And next one shows again kind of units. So, we need to know how much material we're dealing with, where it's stored, and so forth. Some of the challenges I've just talked about a little bit, but we've had a lot of missed opportunities with, for example, storage, timing. So, for example, the poultry market basement was clad in cork as insulation in essence. We had an interested party in recycling all of that, but the logistics of getting their trucks to site in time to take the huge quantity that we had in the building wasn't possible to marry up. Some of those simple aspects make it incredibly disappointing and disheartening. Risk and liability. We try and give away far more material than we can. Either companies don't want it because it's not certified, it's not tested, or it's a risk for the client because it's still the client's material that they are giving to somebody. Undoubtedly, there's been additional cost as well involved in this as a process, time, effort, and investment from the client, trying to make sure that we can achieve the end result.
Hi, I'm Emily from Assemble. This is just a picture of us having lunch in our yard by a skip in Bow. So I thought it's a bit of a nod to the theme of today, of when to reuse and the challenges that come with it. So I'm going to talk about a really small project. It's Bramcote Park in Southwark. It's a public park next to Millwall Stadium, and we're working on it together with Local Works to transform it into a thriving public space. So the overall narrative, I won't talk about it too much because I'm just going to talk about the reuse bit, but is to make this park the new front garden to the houses that it's surrounded by, and to kind of reuse as much as possible in the process of doing this, and have a kind of more active square in the north and a wilder woodland in the south, and reuse is kind of at the heart of all of the processes, from the kind of the soft works to the hard landscaping to the park infrastructure. So led by Local Works, much like some of the other projects, we did this material audit to kind of squeeze out of the site as much potential as we could. And we really categorized things by size, material, condition, their storage requirements, and all of these are kind of really important to consider whether we can then reuse them. And so we're really right at the start of the project. We did a sort of test piece, partly to just engage the people who are living there, but also to kind of make ourselves to start think about what we really wanted to do. So here are the existing swing barriers with no swings. And the idea was to make a notice board to tell the residents what was going to happen, make the notice board from the swing barrier, use the rubber from the ground for the pin board. This is quite a kind of nice picture of the transformation of the swing barrier. But I mean, we didn't really have enough budget to do it properly. So actually we had to chop its legs off at the ground and not lift it out with its existing footings. So even though, it's a kind of fun indicator of what's to come, it kind of plays into the reuse narrative. Actually, it was really expensive to do, and we're going to have to pour some new concrete to put it in the ground in the new park at the end. So ultimately, maybe it's not a good example of reusing well, but we learn from our mistakes. So this is the existing goal, which is part of this multi-use games area, which is going to be transformed into a much more open square, but we're going to keep the goal And the idea is to keep as much as the infrastructure that we're going to keep in the park on site. So we're going to lift out the ground with its footings and then replace it in its new position with these kind of timber additions and new colourful netting and these new kind of chestnut posts that are attached to it. And they're screwed into the original goalposts. And so the park becomes more open as a result, but we get to reuse this infrastructure. And it seemed like a kind of small thing to do, but obviously required drawing up in really a lot of detail, and also making sure that our chestnut posts were actually driven into the ground, not using any concrete foundations, so using these kind of fence post principles, so that they kind of sit quite deep in the ground, surrounded by gravel, so any moisture then drains away and doesn't get kind of stuck in these concrete fittings. And working out the connections from the new timber additions to the old goal posts then provides all sorts of kind of worry for Southwark Council, who are the client, in terms of warranty for the project and how long it's going to last, and getting the fabricators on side to do this. These have all been challenges because, I mean, mainly because of warranty, because it doesn't give, it used to be an off-the-shelf product and now it's a bespoke product, which has warranties for different bits of it, but not for the whole thing. So it's a really ongoing conversation with Southwark to kind of get them on board that it's going to be okay, and it's going to last, and it's going to look good. One of our quite big wins is the trees for the park. So this is actually this was a temporary installation. This was called Fleeting Forest, and this was installed last Christmas in Granary Square. And this was a brief for a project that was commissioned by the Argent, the developer. So kind of a very different client to Southwark Council with very different amounts of money. And this was to design a Christmas tree. And so we used this, entering this project as a provocation. So can we use the temporary installation positively to impact communities and environments in the long term? So if we were going to do this, we needed to kind of sensitively gather and disperse materials, tweak the brief, and make this pot of money work harder. So we proposed to Argent that we just buy lots of existing trees, we store them in King's Cross, and then once the Christmas period comes to an end, we move them, and then we eventually plant them in Bramcote Park in Southwark. So our small council-led project can then benefit from a slightly kind of performative installation, and wastage is minimal. These trees are also wonky trees, so they're usually rejected by large public projects. So it's kind of a bit like wonky veg. We got more trees for a smaller price. But I mean, like it's been mentioned this afternoon, the main challenges with this have been storage. We had to work with Southwark to find a site to put the trees, because obviously work hasn't started on Bramcote Park yet, and these trees need to be kept alive before they get planted in Bramcote Park. So we worked with Southwark to find a spot to keep them and somebody to water them in the correct way. And that has not been super straightforward. And I think they're doing okay, but some of them are not doing so well. And hopefully we'll have enough trees at the end. But you know, it's an added complication to doing something like that. So we're also working with Ashwell's Reclamation Yard and Fallen and Feld, who collect and mill fallen London hardwood trees for lots of the play objects around the park, as well as putting in sleepers, reclaimed sleepers for the retaining walls. And this is an existing oak that we're going to use, and this is at Fallenfeld. So we're going to do things like this very big log sculpture, and we're going to chop the legs off this existing bench, and we're going to put it in the log, and we're trying to. I put this in because this is sort of our inspiration. We're trying to kind of make it really visible that we're not doing too much to the materials that we're putting in the park, but we're doing it playfully. This is the day that Ben from Local Works found this oak log, which we don't think basically we need to do too much to. We think we can, as long as we get it to the site, it's going to be a really amazing thing in the park that will be used really well. And then there's kind of less visible moments. So all of the topsoil is being reused, and also the self-binding gravel path is going to be using stone waste instead of standard Brendan gravel. And so what happens with Local Works is that they make a load of samples that then they have been testing from really early on in the project to make sure that the gravel path is to the correct standard, and we can put that in our specification. And then a lot of the new timber is chestnut that is coming from a relatively local coppice, Kent woodland. So we think it's going to be a really beautiful project. Reuse is at the heart of it. Some of it really not noticeable in the paths and the topsoil and the reusing of the bins. And then some of it will be a lot more visible and kind of weird and a bit more performative in some of the pieces of infrastructure. And that will kind of give it its narrative and its charm. And yeah, that's it.
All right, thanks everyone. That was great. Thank you for introducing or using some really cool vocabulary that I've been writing down. Some of my favorite words and terms: self-binding, wonky, performative, component hunter, wastage. This is my favorite: large lapse, reduced cupping. I never thought I would write that sentence. Physical capital, meat racks, bones, and the most used word was wins, I think. So we can reflect on those, but I just wanted to start with a really practical question. And it's kind of what we want the point of today to be. So you all have the beginnings of something really interesting, and you've made heroic efforts. So how do you think you can kind of reproduce or replicate these efforts without like a new class of consultants sort of emerging and, taking all of that excitement and interest away from you in a sense? Or do you need more people to consult with? So for instance, Dylan, what you learned working with BCA about how to reuse these particular oak panels, is there anything practical that you learned from that in terms of the specific material or in terms of the protocols that you think you can easily apply again? And therefore, out of this relationship, it's the architect themselves that's gained knowledge rather than outsourcing it to like a new class of reuse consultants. And maybe same kind of question to everyone.
Yeah. I think those relationships are productive and exciting and valuable. And I think everyone's spoken about the benefits of engaging in, with these material facilitators. So I think that part will always need to be played, and because the materials themselves require testing. I think that there are additional aspects to those products or those materials that necessarily sit outside the architect's remit. I think importantly, we've talked about the ways that the architect continues to be fundamental to the reuse, which is in specification and in drawing and in detailing. I think it's not often that you come to an architecture lecture and there's so many Excel spreadsheets shown on, but those are the kind of those actually are the kind of exciting parts that have stayed with the architects. I mean, I know that all of us have often worked with material index or deconstruct, but I think scheduling is part of what architects do, and it's not very sexy, but it does actually. It does mean that we continue to understand the materials that make up the project, and that we have that ability to kind of retain an understanding of the holistic, everything that's there in the building or that might go one way or another.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you. For the LSE, we have a very wide and big team. We have, I would say, 4 sustainability consultants for everyone for different aspects of the project. We have a circular economy consultant on the team, one that works with the contractor and one that actually supervises from the client side. So it's actually big word is collaboration. And it's not something that is actually taken out from the architect as a expertise, but it's something that we need. We need people to talk about materials. We need to work with the specificity of the material itself. So we need the expert on the stone, the expert on the bricks, and in order to then know how to reuse them in the best way possible, and actually make the client confident that it is something feasible and something that we can do. And I think I like that you noticed the win word, because it is a big fight actually, and it is a fight against business as usual. Every time that we try to, it sounds really simple move, but then it requires a huge effort from the architect, the whole designing team, to prove that it actually is possible and is not so dangerous. And so every time it feels like a win if you are able to save, a few stones and few bricks. And but it requires a big cultural shift, I think, in our profession, and in not just within architecture, but especially project managers. Logistic is really, really a shift that we need to push forward, and we need to do it together. So I think actually working as a big and wide team is essential, is important, and we can't avoid it.
I was just going to say, architects are there and they're reliant upon the specialists to provide them with advice, and then they make their own judgment based upon all of the information that's presented to you. So you make an informed decision. So I think you do need the sustainability specialists. I think over time you'll recognise that some of them are just telling you what you already knew and what you felt in your gut was right. But there are little nuances sometimes that may trip you up. So you've just got to take them on board and choose the ones you believe are providing you with the right advice. As you mentioned, I think you've already won. I've been dismantling buildings for 28 years, and in the last 5 years, it's gone from maybe one every other year to one every year, 2 every year. At the moment, we've got 8 buildings in storage. It's on this real trajectory, and I think that the narrative now is really focused on sustainability and repurposing and reuse, and everybody's doing something in my very simplistic view, everyone's doing something for one of 3 reasons. It's morally correct, financially correct, or legally it's driving you to do that. And at the moment, the planning policies in London are driving you to look at sustainability and repurposing and reuse. And that's what's really making you or made you change your ways. But now everybody's starting to recognise it as a moral necessity. And bizarrely, financially, dismantling and repurposing stone is cost neutral with new stone. So it's always been there as an option, and we've always been doing it, but we've never sort of told anyone about it. But it is there as a go-to if you want to.
I'd love to return to that question of cost. So stone is financially neutral. I wonder if that could possibly apply to other materials. But quickly, first, would you two like to say something in terms of replicating the knowledge that you've gained on these projects and how to sort of integrate it into your practices going forward?
I mean, I would say the key thing with the Bramcote Park was having those conversations as early as possible, so that it wasn't, we've just gone into tender now, and that's when you get the client being suddenly asking about the warranties, or suddenly asking how something fixes something else. And we really had to have that knowledge from local works or the fabricators or the Fallen and Feld. We really had to have that kind of look very, very ready in order to answer those questions in the program that we had to deliver the project. So, and some of it we didn't have enough time, or we didn't have enough knowledge. So I would say that if we did it again, or if we did it with something else, we would build in to have speaking with the relevant people earlier than we did in that one. Even though we tried to do it early, I'd do it earlier.
I think the material specialists are kind of key to understanding how you take it forward. But I think it's very hard to replicate what you encounter on one building to another. Sometimes there are repeats, of course. But for example, there were huge swathes of these buildings that we couldn't gain access to until we were already on site. So, you have to be able to make decisions or be informed by what you're encountering as you go as well. And you can repeat, of course you can repeat and learn from, but I think that sensitivity to what that found condition is kind of inherently underlying how you take it forward.
Do any of you sense a growing kind of flexibility and more scope for nuance and like an evolving conversation? So I guess there are two ways. We either like go earlier, develop more expertise, really have the numbers to sort of prove the argument, or we work towards a system that's simply more accommodating of the late decisions that reuse and adaptive reuse requires. Like, I guess the trajectory is in the first one, but do you sense any potential in the second as well? Like, as the climate changes, not climate change, but as the climate around this changes, do you sense more possibility and more flexibility?
So maybe really depends in which country you work, and I think which country. Yes, if you work in the UK, often is like really, really difficult to get anything, changed. I mean, everything is a change after it's kind of perceived finished design phase. In this kind of project, the design phase is actually run through until the date that you finish the building and is actually built. So it's a reevaluation of what you set at the beginning, because maybe, the material is not suitable at some point. Maybe you need to change the sizes. We're still actually debating how to reuse part of these stones. We are reevaluating the design of the counter, and I mean, the site is already open, and so it is very much also a different approach to the design phase, because the design phase is not actually finishing. It's a kind of process that keeps going until you finish construction, and this overlapped, and construction is part of the design phase. But I think there are, for example, places, experience in Italy where you have a much closer contact within the site work. So it's not so detached between the design work and the site. Actually, the architect is very much part of the decision making on site, and share knowledge and learn so much also from people working on site and making decision on this shared knowledge. And I think it might be a very good test to try also.
We're getting involved in projects at stage 1 and stage 2 now. And we're working out the volume of stone on buildings, sometimes at pre-purchase. So the client can then present to the architect a building and say, and they treat the building as a quarry, not as a building. They're saying, right, you've got 400 meter cube of stone. And when you design the rebuild, that's all you have to rebuild the facades. So they're sort of explaining to them what their limitations are on material reuse. And that, to a certain extent, is being driven by City of London and Westminster's expectations for repurposing and reusing of the materials in its most beneficial form. But we've also had a project recently where we worked out what the volume of stone is so that the developer can go to the Westminster and say, I'm going to remove this building and I'm going to use it on another site with another developer to develop their building. So you're almost creating a futures market for the materials on a building before the building's being dismantled. So it's been a real shift from just dismantling and rebuilding facsimiles of the original building to sort of working as a futures trader in the materials on the building. So there is this need for this knowledge and expertise early, and it is really being driven by legislation that's making the developer and the architects just think a bit deeper.
Wow, fascinating. Anything to add? Aude-Line, do you want to ask something?
If I can just add briefly to that, I think flexibility into the end of a project is so important, and that I think in a way Churchill benefited from starting as a traditional project, getting to tender as if it was going to be a traditional, and then became design and build after that. And so the building was drawn as if it was ready to be built. In that sense, rather and not like a kind of traditional designer build tender might look like. So I think it benefited, and I think in a way, going back to your question about the architect's position, I think the lateral ability to think laterally and to absorb changes on site, and tolerance is so key in not only literally with materials but in capacity to change design decisions quickly. And so I think, ultimately we have to retain that level of movability and a kind of openness all the way to the last minute.
Yeah. I would just also add, you can even apply that idea of flexibility in the way that you draw things up as well, because there's this thing about having to draw with an extra level of detail and care when you're dealing with things that are not off the shelf, and that taking up a whole load of time, way more time than if it had been a new product, but then also it then changing once it starts building. And I think I don't quite know the solution to that, but I think that we have to think about being flexible and new ways of drawing and new ways of presenting our ideas on site in order to make that process easier for us and for whoever's building, because I think that's a kind of key sticking point sometimes.
There are models of kind of applying for, say, planning with, there've been some really interesting models recently of applying, for example, for a project for planning with kind of a zone for a window that will be a reclaimed window. They don't know exactly what yet, and having to get the planners on board with that as a theory. It's a notional thing that will be in notionally this zone, and kind of closing that out once they have sourced the actual windows themselves. And I think that it's quite unusual in that kind of quite regimented system that is planning, but kind of I think the more embracing of that the rest of the culture becomes, the more ability we'll all have to be able to respond to it. designing within a structural zone for a beam that we might be reclaiming from somewhere.
With all the policy incentive and the willingness of being more circular, can embed more flexibility and allow for serendipity to happen and more randomness and contingency also to meet some reuse or to create a context that would be more fertile for reuse. And Claire, the project you were mentioning, which is quite a strong precedent actually, is a project by Rotor for the Zinneke project, where they actually got planning with a dashed line saying the window will be the window that's going to be available on the market at that time.
And Global Generation, I think, tried to copy your model and have successfully done it in the UK as well.
Brilliant. But yeah, I think it's a good metaphor, and if this kind of approach could be applied also for storage facilities, because this is also a big question, but really also budgetary window. And I had the question for you, Emily, because everyone knows that it takes much longer to work with an hybrid structure of chestnut branches with an existing digged out basketball structure, rather than just buying China's made product on catalog, which is the main market for this type of urban furniture. It's mostly China-made components that you can buy on catalog. So the architecture task is much more demanding, basically. But how do you work out the budget? Because suddenly you end up designing things you would just possibly buy on catalog. And so how do you kind of moderate your budget once you start putting so much gray matter, in your design?
I have to give you the honest answer. I don't think with that goal example, we did the budget very well. I mean, I spent a lot of time, basically. It's been of more expense to us drawing it than it would have been if we just specified a product from a catalogue, definitely. But I think one of the key reasons that we are still doing it is because we know, as part of the material audit, we did a kind of skills audit around the park as well. So the metal fabricators are really local to the park, and we're really keen on doing a lot of the furniture. And they were the ones actually who were like, oh, let's keep everything on site. We can get our equipment onto the site for the amount of time that it will take to lift it and move it and bolt in the new timbers. We don't have to, because what would have made it really ridiculous would have been if we'd had to take the goal apart, take it to their workshop, re-put it together in the workshop, take it back to the site. That definitely would have been ridiculous to have done that. But because we've managed to have this conversation with local fabricators who want to keep it on site and then bring their tools to the site, it seems like it's going to be a really kind of nice thing. And then also that the Southwark already have their sort of maintenance team for their general infrastructure for their parks. So we've had conversations with them about the repainting and the bolting, and to make sure that that's in line with what they do. So, yeah, I mean, that's not a very clear answer, but it's ongoing. Ask me again in 6 months.
I think, let's ask for questions from the audience, please. There are microphones to pass around.
Yeah, that works. Hi, everyone. I think building up on the sort of last question and answer, I mean, you've presented all great projects, and obviously you have all faced difficulties in various ways, but you've managed to, keep going and push and overcome those difficulties. So my question is, you've done that obviously because you are, say, good designers, right? Because you were very keen and you wanted to make the right choice. But there are lots of people there that they are not as keen because they don't want to spend more time designing because they don't get enough fee. Or there are lots of clients that maybe, I'm sure your clients have been, you had to make education process to them. They have to make them being ambitious, but they were ambitious. Lots of clients are now ambitious. What needs to happen is my question, so that the choice to reuse buildings and to reuse materials is no longer the right choice, but is the only choice. So that, everybody does it because of maybe cost. Maybe, I don't know, is there or maybe time, because time is also cost. So what needs to happen in terms of policy and cost? I don't know, do we create a sort of extraction tax so that, new virgin materials are so expensive that nobody wants to use? It's for everybody.
I think ultimately, until policy starts dictating it and making it like the normal choice of the way to behave, unfortunately, everyone around this table has got a lot of will, and a lot of clients do. But I think, for example, new London Plan does go quite far, but it's not enforcing a lot of the kind of carbon aspirations within it. Until that becomes a must versus just it's going to become into the public record that you've not met what you said you were going to meet. There's not enough incentive for the bad clients or the bad, not bad, but for the people who aren't kind of really pushing the envelope to kind of take that route. Maybe that's a bit pessimistic, but it feels like until people's hands are forced, that's not going to become the normal.
I think the fact that VAT still favours new build rather than renovation is as once that changes, we might see a dramatic switch, and that just has to happen. Certainly in the UK, but I think also in terms of incentives for people to and developers and clients to become more comfortable in that space. I think how quickly we've all become literate with the metrics for embodied carbon and operational carbon, I think we similarly need to become more literate with metrics for circularity. So whether material quantity, reuse, etc. I think once those start to make it into ESG commitments, for example, for major clients, those will be driving down, from that direction. If you're talking about kind of, larger scale clients that might not necessarily have a way to quantify exactly what it is that they're doing, that's so great.
I think we are seeing it to a certain extent. It's slowly ratcheting. Institutional developers are looking at neighbours and LETI results rather than BREEAM. Residential developers are looking at air source heat pumps and solar panels integrated into the roofs. So two slightly different elements. But it is just starting to sort of ratchet in the way that we'd all like to see it go. Certain developers we're working with, they're looking at their carbon cost per metre squared, and they're really driving it down to a number that sits well with their carbon neutrality plans. So it is sort of happening. It's not happening enough, but it is happening, and I think it'll get better or tighter. That means everybody's going to have to do it. But I'm not sure. I put 2030 on my slide, but maybe that's a bit optimistic. But I think it will move that way eventually.
I think also, we are in a school, so I think education is very, very key to this process. So the more the new architect generation will push this agenda. I think, the part one, part two, they need to demand to the entire office or to that they work with, really to follow their agenda. the things that has been discussed or they discuss day to day at school, I think that also is a big shift in terms of our profession, because it's a different way of designing, and schools should, teach this approach. And as you know, I'm very fan of kind of schools or architectural schools to be driving this change really within the profession.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to support that point. I am full of trust for the new generation. I can see already what they've done in changing the working culture in many places. It's true that, it's still a niche and it's quite precise as input, but as part of the global discussion, discussion certainly has an impact. And so, yes, I think that's where we put our trust for the moment. And I think architects, as we all know, we have a limited agency. But I think we still have a say into defining a certain form of aestheticism and working with strong reference projects that are able to shift the aestheticism towards embracing, weathering or randomness and components that you might find that are more similar to reuse, or even embracing very recent reclaimed components. So, for example, components from the 90s, from the 2000s, just things that have just recently fall into unloved category, kind of re-embracing them. Like all this form of design elasticity can very much be implemented into the architectural culture. And I think that would help also on the long run.
Hello. Provided that we only design with pre-cut materials which have been extracted already, then we need to change the entire way we design, because we no longer can start with abstract shapes. We can only be guided by predetermined dimensions. So essentially, maybe we should in fact start designing by selecting where the material is coming from and only then be concerned with the shape. Thank you.
I don't know if this is directed at me, because I showed a new build project. But I think fundamentally we need to be starting with buildings that exist and favouring those buildings. And that means that it's always that's the largest place in terms of carbon and material saving and waste saving to begin. So yes, I think we need to let go of, an ambition to define the look of a building more than the existing building already has. I think fundamentally that's what all of us will be doing in 20 years, is working with those what's given already, and just finding new configurations.
Do you want to say? Yeah, go on.
I would just add that I think there's a real joy in that. I think that's a way of giving yourself some design parameters that then give you a focus, and then it's you can do some really beautiful design once you've actually got some rules to work with, and I think that's a really hopeful and optimistic way of looking at it, rather than seeing it as a compromise.
Just so we're not completely self-congratulatory, everyone's done a great job, but I think we should acknowledge that many of these projects come with a shadow. Even there have been heroic adaptive reuse efforts, but behind that is a building that was demolished. Wasn't your fault, but maybe didn't need to be demolished if the City of London had been able to think more creatively about it. I'd be interested to hear what you think about we all know about greenwashing. I think reuse washing will become a major thing if it's not already. There are other things that we need to contend with. And the bigger challenges of platform capitalism today. So there's a big kind of conceptual push to digitize the process of material reuse, to put everything on the blockchain, and like to go to these hyper meta scales, like to sort of rush to that scale as fast as we can, which could enable something like a futures market. And then we conceive of the city as a urban mine, which actually encourages a faster process of demolition, which is not what we want either. So there's definitely a scope for this practice to be co-opted by the platform capitalist machine. So I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that and how we can push against that, because the great thing about reuse is that it's sort of inherently indigestible by business as usual, right? And that's why we're all interested in it. But business as usual will try its best to digest us. So how do we make ourselves spiky?
I would say that I would favor a change of scale. So if business as usual becomes, let's say, reuse, then yes, I think we should be happy about like making it as wide as possible, as like normal as possible. I agree that there is always the danger of telling a story that is not true, or maybe telling a story that is something really superficial, and then you try to make it big thing out of it. Definitely, always. But then as far as you try to initiate through processes, especially try to be as local as possible, try to involve the local manufacturer, create opportunities that actually stay within the local environment so people can learn. For example, Pay is an enormous company, like it's a great expertise, but the more we normalize this system, the more we are able to actually invest in local, smaller, maybe contractor that can be learning the process, that can be just like as available as maybe bigger and more reliable. So if you start kind of, apprenticeships, really think about like the social sustainability part of this, reuse, and making it available and really instigating processes that are sustainable. In that case, then I think we will avoid easily kind of reuse washing. If you always try to, work locally with the local community as much as you can within your project.
I think there's a kind of inherent conflict in reuse, in that we obviously want encourage people to retain their materials, to preserve their materials, but the people who have material wealth, material capital, we're encouraging them more to retain that material capital and to capture that material capital. And so, yes, there is a kind of fundamental question about actually how does that play into the system that you're talking about. And I think probably the project by yourself, Emily, is a kind of great example of where, two projects simultaneously using an asset, a tree, I hate, but is actually finds its way actually through one project into another, and it has a lasting benefit in like the community. Is like to me, at this table, feels like a great way to kind of counteract that conflict.
More questions from the crowd?
Thank you. Have a specific question for Dylan, because I was luckily visited Conga Court on Tuesday, and from the photo you showed, it's a very long distance. And there's a shot that I can see the connections between the wooden facade and existing buildings. But when I was actually there, I was kind of curious. So when the idea become wood panel, so when does that idea come from? Or in what kind of the phase of the design? So, because maybe I'm just curious, will it be better to have similar textures to the existing buildings that will make people, when they're visiting it in a human scale, they will start to have more connections between the existing building and the new build project. So I was basically I'm curious about when was the timing that the idea, or we will use wood as the facade instead of the other material.
I think what I was trying to do with the first part of the presentation was talk about the process of translation from the existing and the reading of the existing building, it being translated into the new building, and so the investigation of the existing building and its materiality. But to find a kind of new brutalist aesthetic using timber effectively. And so in terms of the reuse of the timber, originally it was proposed to be new oak. We went with reclaimed oak because we had a conversation about how oak ages, and it has this kind of, it looks really beautiful at the start, and it looks really beautiful after 20 years, and then it has this kind of awkward adolescent period in between. And I think that Cambridge, again, as the client who has a very long-term view of things, was very comfortable taking on reclaimed as a much more stable thing. It's really about a reading of the concrete and brick and timber materiality of the existing building, finding a kind of a new translation, and the fact that all of the concrete on the existing building is board marked with timber felt like a kind of a way to reflect and see it as part of that. Sorry to take up.
More questions from the floor? Would you be able to pass the mic?
Thanks. One question, it might actually be a silly question to ask, but I'll ask it anyway. In some projects, I'm not saying your projects, I would assume that the CO2 emission saving is quite low. And I was thinking that I could imagine a project which is very complex to design and build, and therefore has increased labor hours and also potential economic cost. And I was thinking that is it a possibility that this increase in labor hours, and more people working for more hours using computers or their hands building stuff, maybe this increase is not worth it and produces more CO2?
That's a good question. Very tough question. It's a very high bar.
Even the food they used to have the energy to work enough.
Can I say something, maybe? I'm thinking maybe that outcome in itself can be a reason to practice reuse as well, because we're maybe pushing for labor, we're pushing for more hours, but maybe that in itself feeds a certain thing that we are aiming for with reuse in another way, perhaps.
A solution for widespread unemployment of architects.
I just refer to that as the meaning of life. Why are we doing these things? We've got to do it as best as we can, to our best efforts, and use our best endeavours. but it is a balance. It is a balance between employment and material use and carbon cost. So I don't know what the answer is there. It's a big equation.
We often say that reuse is an alibi because for just designing and thinking in a more interesting way as well. So it's not that we want to create a new kind of accountancy system for ourselves, but we want to find a new design language that also happens to be much more responsible in terms of material throughput and carbon, embodied carbon.
So producing prototypical projects might be repeated in a more efficient way.
Indeed, yes, that was the point, and maybe it's a good loop, because the purpose of this roundtable is also to collect precedent and exemplary project that, people are investing so much means to pioneer, but once they're there, we can reuse them and argue for them and show the client that it's been done before. And this client will make the life hopefully easier for the next replication to occur. But nevertheless, I wanted to congratulate your thinking because it's important to always think about the externalities. And you've mentioned a few possible negative avenues, but then Tugra was mentioning the few possible positive ones, and they really should be celebrated. We can think about decentralized economy, investing in much local labor. There is still a huge saving in transportation, that should be taken into the equation, which will probably very quickly compensate for the extra lunches and dinner of the labor force. And so I think all in all, it's still something to, worth investing. And then without talking about the joy, as Emily was saying, but also the diversity of aesthetism and possibly the eclecticism. And that's something we can also see in some practice that have been operating with reused components in decades. I can think about retrievers, which are there. This is also a strong design signature that is enriching the architectural culture. So for all these facts and figure and component is still very worth continuing pursuing. And also I have to say for the joy of education, it's an alibi to give a chance to all of us to take time to observe first, to start observing what is there. And I think that's also what reuse has been helping us doing, is to say, it's okay to observe, it's okay to take the time, it's okay to appreciate the existing, and let's wait a bit before projecting our own vision, and this also in this kind of sequencing of design thinking that has been very helpful as well.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I have just one comment. Sure.
Yeah.
I think just one thing. Firstly, it was not a silly question, definitely. And maybe I have a silly answer. And a silly answer is yes, that extra carbon is worth it. Firstly, because those people will still need to eat their lunch and will still need to work somewhere. So if they work within a sustainable with all the problems project, then be it. And that means also that the sustainable work or projects, they will create green jobs, if we, telling with a politician type of language. So probably, yes, it's worth it. But at the same time, yes, that extra carbon needs to be taken into account in the sort of whole life carbon sort of calculation. So for the projects which maybe will still be worth it. But the other thing is probably to also go back to some of the, the slides earlier, that even if we reuse materials, even if we reuse building, maybe we still need to build less at the same time. So it's not just to build less or no new buildings, but we need to build less entirely and reuse at the same time. Because in that way, then maybe we can have an impact.
No, the key thing to my question was about the projects that do a very complex solution for very minimum CO2 effect on the construction. So in this case, the people who still eat, they will have time to work on another project to save more.
But if you saw from Maria's presentation, the carbon savings were massive. Go ahead. Okay.
I mean, I think it's like you can't say yes or no broadly to that question. It's you ask that question each time you have to make a decision within a project, and sometimes it is worth it, and sometimes it's not, and you can't. And within a whole, you saw this tiny park project compared to like the museum. Within that, there's all sorts of decisions, and some of them you have to make where you spend the extra time because it's worth it, and then some of them you don't do that because it's not worth it, and it's just a whole kind of timeline of asking that question over and over again, and kind of biasing yourself towards that. I think it's worth it, so I have to keep asking that as I go through the process. I think that would be my reflection.
I think it's an excellent point. Like, there's a whole swathe of things that we didn't show there, but for example, the specification of a block that we're utilising. Yes, no one loves block work, but it has its time and its place. The specification of that, where it's recycled and reused, and kind of the best option we can within that as a material selection. Asking that fundamental question before you specify every single item makes. Yeah, you have to do some research, of course, and that's where the kind of circling back can help. Each time you specify that, next time you'll be able to understand the better selection, the better choice. And I think that kind of process of always improving will help us to get to better solutions. And by asking the question every single time, it will only mean we'll make improvements moving forward.
I think it's a good time to wrap up now. And actually we have to. Thank you all so much for joining us and your intelligent questions and generous contributions. And we can all come away a bit galvanized. So thank you so much. And stick around. There's some drinks when those doors open. They're